Yo guys, Paunchy here, and today I wanted to tell you a little story about a friend of mine, and hopefully it'll be something that can help a lot of people out if they're in the market for a new drum machine. So basically, a friend of mine came to me recently and he wanted to know what kind of drum machine he should buy now in 2022. So there were a couple things I immediately thought of asking him that were pretty important as far as what kind of drum machine he was looking for. Now, a little bit of background about him. He's been in rock bands most of his life. He's really into garage rock stuff, kind of like King Khan and Barbecue, Bloodshot Bill, you know, that type of thing. Black Lips, Ty Segall, if you're familiar with any of those bands. But, you know, the first thing I wanted to know is whether he was looking for more of like a sample-based drum machine, or if he was looking for something that generates its own drum sounds. So something sample-based would be something kind of like this model samples that I have here. And also I wanted to mention that his budget, he told me, was around the $300 range, give or take, you know, no more than $400 or so. So, you know, that kind of limited his choices a little bit. Not to say that, you know, the more you spend, the better you're gonna be or whatever, but, you know, that was his budget, so we had to think within those parameters. So the model samples is definitely a great one for that kind of stuff if you're looking for a sample-based drum machine. But then I started thinking, do you want to do anything melodic with it? Because if you do, there are some caveats to that, of course. So the biggest thing with melodic stuff is, do you want something that's polyphonic or monophonic? You know, something like the model samples, unfortunately, can only play one note at a time, so it would be monophonic. You know, you can certainly upload your own samples, you know, whether it's drums or melodic samples like synth samples into this machine. However, you can't play any of them polyphonically, so you can't really do chords per se, unless of course you upload samples of chords into this thing, which can work in some situations, but it kind of gets tricky. He told me that he wanted a drum machine that he could play guitar with and sing along with, but that could also do, you know, some melodic stuff. But being as, for him, you know, he would be playing the guitar, which of course can handle either chords or melodies. So he decided that, you know, being polyphonic wasn't necessarily important to him. However, I did show him the circuit tracks that I have here. This thing is probably one of the best little sampler drum machine thingies, because not only does it have 4 tracks for drums, but it also has 2 synth tracks as well as MIDI tracks. So I told him, you know, if you wanted something that's really great at doing beats that can also play melodic samples and generate its own sounds, basically, then this would be for him. So what I realized is important to me is to be able to craft my own sounds rather than have to rely on samples that are, you know, stuck a certain way. Or, you know, of course you can manipulate samples on most samplers, but to me, I prefer synth sounds that I can shape myself. So I also showed him something like the model cycles. Now the difference between the model cycles and the model samples is that the model samples is just a sample-based machine, whereas the model cycles can generate its own synth sounds because it has a synth engine within it. So you might ask yourself, can you do beats with the model cycles? The answer is actually yes. So this is yet another machine similar to the circuit tracks where you could, you know, split it up. You have 6 tracks on the model cycles here, along with 6 tracks on the model samples. But with this one, you could easily split up maybe, you know, 3 tracks into drum tracks, 3 tracks of melodic synth sounds. Now, this is an FM synthesizer, It's not really important necessarily how FM synths work, but just know that FM synthesis is a different type of synth, and it sounds way different than the normal synths you might be used to, which are subtractive synthesis. And that's more of what the circuit tracks is capable of doing. So, you know, those are all great because they're all within his budget. You know, I also have the circuit Rytm, definitely a great sampler. You know, the difference between this and the circuit tracks is that you can sample directly onto it and then manipulate the samples how you want on here. Not to mention, this thing actually has 8 tracks, which compared to the circuit tracks or the model cycles or samples, this by far has the most tracks out of all of them, which is super nice. Definitely great for beats, but you know, of course you can also upload your own melodic samples on here. The only thing this doesn't have is a synth engine. So, you know, ultimately you get some trade-offs with these things. And, you know, one thing I think is important to keep in mind is that none of these things, especially in that budget range, none of these things are perfect machines. You know, they all have limitations. You know, I always think it's kind of interesting, it's kind of funny when people expect so much out of a $300 sampler or drum machine, whatever it may be. And again, it's not necessarily how much money you spend. It's just all about being honest with what it is you actually need and what it is you might think that you might use in the future. So that's another thing I brought up to him, is that, you know, you might want to think about future-proofing yourself. So the thing about the circuit tracks, being as it has 2 synth tracks, 4 drum tracks, and then it also has 2 MIDI tracks. So the interesting thing about that is, if you buy this as your starting drum machine, starting synth, however you want to look at it, you also have these 2 MIDI tracks that can sequence other synths, external synths. So this, in terms of future-proofing, is amazing because, you know, once you buy something like this, you're probably going to end up buying another synth or something like that. So if you buy another synth, you can sequence it via MIDI with the circuit tracks. You know, so this could become your beat machine, and then you have, you know, 1 or 2 extra MIDI tracks depending on how many synths you get, but that way you would end up with 4 total synth tracks. So that's something to keep in mind. The other thing I told him he should be aware of is whether or not you want a drum machine or sampler to be able to do full songs, basically, if you want it to have a song mode. So essentially what song mode does is it makes it so you can have multiple patterns and then chain them together and play it all just by pressing one button, usually just by pressing play. So the cool thing about the circuit tracks and circuit Rytm is that you can create scenes. If you're familiar with Ableton at all, very similar to that, you can create scenes which are essentially multiple patterns chained together, and then once you press play, it'll essentially just play all those patterns in the order that you choose. Whereas something like the model samples and model cycles, you would have to manually trigger each pattern individually. So that's something to keep in mind. You know, if you're going to be like my friend and you're going to be singing and playing guitar, both of your hands are going to be taken up and busy, so you don't have time, you don't have as much time to be able to, you know, switch between patterns and stuff like that. Those are some of the best options in that price range. Of course, there are many synths, many drum machines, many samplers. Just recently I got one of the Sonicware Liven XFMs, and this thing is amazing. It's an FM synth, very similar to the model cycles. However, this thing has a pretty amazing sequencer on it, not gonna lie, and you can also do drum tracks on this. So not only can you come up with synth sounds and bass sounds via the FM synthesis, you can also create beats with this thing. However, it only has 4 tracks. So that's something to keep in mind, but also keep in mind that limitations can be a good thing for sure. So it just depends again on what you're looking for. I mean, this thing is also battery powered and has a built-in speaker, which is kind of nice. Not the greatest speaker out there, but it is kind of cool if you want to just sit here and make beats on here like anywhere. You know, you don't have to be tied to a wall outlet. You can go do it at the park if you wanted to on a nice sunny day. Same with the Circuit Rytm and Circuit Tracks. Those are both portable in terms of they're battery powered. So that's something to keep in mind if you want to be able to just kind of take it around anywhere and not have to be constrained by power cables and stuff like that. So, you know, of course I did mention to him things like the MC707 is such an amazing groove box that is, to me, it's like a fully fledged, you know, you can create full songs on it. And not only can you create full songs, but it also has scenes, much like the Circuit Rytm and the Circuit Tracks. However, the scenes on that are more similar to what it's like on Ableton. If you're familiar with Ableton at all, or if you have a push or anything like that. And then, of course, the Deluge is quite an amazing groove box in and of itself. Also battery powered. Also has a speaker, which is pretty cool if you think about it. I mean, the Deluge has to be one of the best out there. You know, definitely along the same lines as the MC707, but I would argue that it might be able to do a couple more things. However, you know, the MC707 has such an extensive library of sounds on it that I don't think you even need to mess around with finding new sounds or sampling or anything like that. So, you know, those are some things to keep in mind when you're shopping for a drum machine in 2022. So, you know, I hope that helps you guys a little bit. You know, my friend, he ultimately decided he's most likely going to go with the Circuit Tracks, which I think is a great solid choice for anybody starting out. But it just depends on what you want. The great thing about the MC707 is its smaller and cheaper counterpart, you know, is capable of a lot of the same stuff, and it's in the price range that he was thinking, that my friend was thinking. So that's also a possibility too. I believe it's the MC101. You know, that thing is pretty amazing in its own right. You know, of course there's trade-offs with everything. You know, it's much smaller and not as many options in terms of how many knobs you have and stuff like that. So, you know, these are all things to keep in mind. So, hope that helps you guys a little bit. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.